and welcome back to Killafornia Dreaming. This is the second part of what is now going to be a 4-part series in the disappearance of Barb Cotton. In part 1, I said it was going to be 3 parts. Well, you know me, and that's not happening. It's going to be 4. It could have probably been 5, but I need to stop. If you haven't listened to part 1, you're going to want to pause this episode here, listen to number 332 first, and then come back to this. I again want to thank Anthony W. for introducing me to this case and to Kathy, Barb's sister. And I would also like to thank Kathy for spending time talking to me every time I had questions about the last minute details surrounding the events of Barb's disappearance and trusting us with her story. So with that, let's get back to it. In part 1, we explored the background of Barb Cotton's large family, the events unfolding in her life in the weeks leading up to her disappearance on April 11th, 1981, and the people who made up her world at that time. We spent a considerable amount of time discussing the dynamics within the Cotton family, and that was intentional. Both Kathy and I believe those dynamics are absolutely essential to understanding this case. Because Barb did not disappear from what most people would describe as a stable or healthy family environment, it would really be doing Barb a disservice to not discuss them in depth. The head of the household, John Cotton Sr., was reportedly an abusive alcoholic who terrorized those closest to him. According to family members, he sexually abused some and possibly all of his daughters. And his second to oldest son, Frank Cotton, followed suit and had reportedly abused his sisters as well. Those allegations alone paint a deeply troubling picture of the environment in which Barb was raised. Meanwhile, the matriarch of the family, Louise Cotton, has been described as a strict and often heavy-handed disciplinarian who frequently relied on corporal punishment to maintain control of her children. She was also known to drink heavily herself. Taken together, what emerges is not the portrait of a peaceful family struggling through a tragedy. It is the portrait of a family carrying around profound dysfunction, trauma, fear, and pain everywhere they go, long before Barb ever vanished. And that matters. In fact, the more I've examined this case, the more frustrated I've become by how little attention that reality seems to have received, not only in 1981, but in all the years and decades that followed. Because when people discuss Barb Cotton's disappearance, the focus has always shifted outward. The conversation turns to boyfriends, acquaintances, strangers, truck drivers, runaways, and countless other possibilities. Entire theories have been built around people on the periphery of Barb's life, if they were even on the periphery to begin with. Meanwhile, one uncomfortable question often seems to get pushed aside. What if the most volatile, abusive, and potentially dangerous people in Barb's world were not outside her family at all? What if they were inside it? That question doesn't come from a place of certainty. It comes from looking honestly at the known history of violence, abuse, addiction, and control that existed within the Cotton household. Today, when a child disappears, investigators routinely begin by examining the people closest to that child. Family members, caregivers, and those within the home are often scrutinized first before attention begins to expand outward. In 1981, things were different. And in Barb's case, it often feels as though investigators skipped over some of the most difficult questions and immediately started looking elsewhere. Maybe there were reasons for that. Maybe information wasn't available. Perhaps certain assumptions were made that seemed reasonable at the time. But standing here more than 4 decades later, I can't help but wonder whether critical opportunities were missed. And if I'm being completely honest, I think there's a reason to be suspicious of some of the narratives that emerged in the immediate aftermath of Barb's disappearance. I think that there is reason to question how certain people became the focus of the investigation. I think there's reason to ask whether investigators were led down paths that ultimately took them farther away from the truth rather than closer to it. That is not an accusation. It is an observation born out of years of unanswered questions and from a case that has remained unsolved for more than 45 years. What makes it especially heartbreaking is that while theories have come and gone, while suspects have been discussed and debated, and while attention has shifted from one possibility to another, Barb herself has remained missing. A 15-year-old girl disappeared. A sister never came home. And a family, regardless of its flaws, was left carrying that loss for generations. The grief of that reality has never gone away. So before we venture further into theories, suspects, and speculation, I think it's important to acknowledge something that may have been overlooked for far too long: the environment in which Barb was living when she vanished. Because whether it ultimately proves to be the key to solving this mystery or not, it is a part of Barb's story, and it deserves to be examined with the same seriousness as every other lead that has been pursued over the last 45 years. With that in mind, let's return to the timeline and pick up from the place where everything changed. Let's go back to the night when Barb disappeared. Unfortunately, what exists today regarding Barb and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance can only really be described as a patchwork of information. Some details come from police reports, some come from family members, some come from interviews conducted decades later, and some come from independent researchers and podcasters who have spent years trying to piece together what happened to her. As a result, compiling a definitive timeline can be challenging. And after all these years, there are still aspects of Barb's final days that remain frustratingly unclear. What is generally accepted is that Barb disappeared sometime between April 11th and April 12th, 1981. Beyond that, many of the details become increasingly difficult to verify with complete certainty. However, one of the last confirmed times Barb was known to have spoken with someone was the day before she vanished. On Friday, April 10th, 1981, Barb spoke on the phone with her friend Diane. Not to be confused with Barb's older sister Diane, who has also played a significant role in the continued effort to find answers, but her friend Diane. The same Diane that Barb was planning to room with after she turned 16. That detail is important because it offers a glimpse into where Barb's life appeared to be headed at the time. According to Diane, Barb told her that she was staying at another girl's house and that they planned to take a dog to the veterinarian the following morning. It was a completely ordinary conversation, the kind of conversation teenagers have every day. There was no indication that this would be one of the last confirmed conversations anyone would ever have with Barb. Diane also reported that she never believed the runaway theory and has never accepted it, even after all these years. And when you look at what was happening in Barb's life at the time, it's easy to understand why. Barb had been working steadily at the country kitchen. She'd been saving her money. In fact, by some accounts, she had accumulated a substantial amount of savings for a 15-year-old girl. She and Diane were making plans to get a place together once Barb turned 16. She was actively planning for her future, not planning to disappear from it. And then there were other things that Barb was looking forward to as well. Just a few months later, in July of 1981, Barb was supposed to serve as the maid of honor in her friend Diane's wedding. It was a significant event for the girls and one that they fully expected Barb to be a part of. Barb had close ties to people, responsibilities, future plans, and milestones that she was excited about reaching. Looking back, that's one of the saddest aspects of this case. The final conversation anyone can definitively place Barb in wasn't about running away, it wasn't about leaving town, it wasn't about escaping her life. It was about staying with a friend, taking the dog to the vet, going to work, saving money, moving out when she got older, and being there for her best friend's wedding. It was about the future. And that is one of the main reasons why so many people who actually knew Barb have struggled for decades to accept the idea that she simply walked away from her life voluntarily. Because when you step back and look at the life she appeared to be building, it doesn't resemble the life of someone preparing to disappear. It doesn't look like the life of someone making plans to sever ties with everyone she knew. It does not look like the life of someone intending to leave without a trace and never looking back. Instead, it looks like the life of a 15-year-old girl who fully expected to wake up the next morning and continue moving forward. A girl who had plans, who had friends, who was talking about the future. A girl who was making decisions based on the assumption that she would still be here tomorrow. That doesn't mean we can know with absolute certainty what was in Barb's mind during those final hours. No one can. Fairness demands that we acknowledge that uncertainty. But what we can do is weigh the evidence against the theories. And when I do that, the notion that Barb voluntarily vanished becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile with the facts. The idea that she simply decided to not be found, the theory that she ran away with no money, no belongings, and no meaningful preparation. The suggestion that Barb abandoned everything and everyone she cared about and somehow managed to remain hidden for more than 45 years. Those explanations require a series of assumptions that many of the people closest to Barb have never found convincing, and certainly not her sister Kathy. And not many of the friends, family members, and people who knew Barb as a real person rather than the name in a case file. For Kathy, the runaway theory has never fit the Barb that she knew. And after listening to her, after examining the circumstances surrounding Barb's disappearance, and after considering the life that Barb appeared to be building for herself, I find myself arriving at much the same conclusion. Not because I want that conclusion to be true. In many ways, it would be easier if Barb had chosen to leave and was somehow still out there living a life of her own making. But the evidence doesn't seem to point in that direction. The people who knew Barb best don't believe it. And the more I learn about Barb, the harder it becomes for me to believe it too. So while everyone is free to draw their own conclusions, I think the theory that Barb voluntarily disappeared deserves to be viewed with a healthy degree of skepticism, because the story her life was telling in those final days sound far less like a goodbye and much more like a future that was suddenly interrupted. And so we arrive at the night that everything changed, the evening of Saturday, April 11th, 1981. This is the point in Barbara Cotton's story where the trail begins to fade and the certainty we've been able to rely upon starts slipping through our fingers. Up until now, we've been examining the pieces of Barb's life that can be understood with a reasonable degree of confidence. We've talked about her family, her friendships, her dreams, her struggles, and the people who shaped the world that she lived in. We've looked at the environment she was growing up in and the circumstances that existed in the days leading up to her disappearance. But this is where things become more difficult. This is where the solid ground begins to give way beneath us. Because when we reach the final known hours before Barb vanished, the story becomes increasingly fragmented. Memories don't always align. Accounts sometimes conflict. Certain details can be verified while others exist somewhere between recollection, rumor, and speculation. And that uncertainty has haunted this case for far too long. For those searching for simple answers, this part of the story can be frustrating. For those who loved Barb, it has been heartbreaking. The closer we get to the moment she disappeared, the fewer certainties remain and the more questions begin to emerge. Yet somewhere within those questions lies the truth. A 15-year-old girl was here one day and then gone the next. Something happened during those final hours. Whether the answers are hidden in a forgotten memory, an overlooked detail, or a story that was never fully told, they exist somewhere. And so with equal parts caution, determination, and hope, we are going to follow the timeline as carefully as we can. Because this is where Barbara's known story ends and where the mystery truly begins. April 11th, 1981. For years, a particular version of events has been repeated over and over. You'll find it on online discussions, missing persons websites, newspaper articles, podcasts, and countless retellings of the case. And according to that commonly accepted narrative, Barb spent part of that evening having dinner in downtown Williston with a friend and her boyfriend. The story goes that after dinner, as they were parting ways, her boyfriend offered to walk her home. Barb supposedly declined that offer. He then watched her walk away alone, heading in the direction of Recreation Park from an area near the Plainsman Hotel. And that's where the story ends. At least that's where the widely circulated version ends. The problem is that the closer I looked at this case, the less comfortable I became treating that account as an established fact. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the foundation beneath that narrative is riddled with uncertainty. Much of the information surrounding that alleged dinner appears to trace back to one source, and that source would be Louise Cotton. According to Kathy, and according to much of what I've been able to piece together, the details about Barb having dinner with a friend and a boyfriend originated with Barb's mother. And that presents a problem, because as we continue through the story, you're going to learn that Louise Cotton is not necessarily a source whose statements should be accepted at face value. And I do not say that lightly. But after examining the circumstances surrounding Barb's disappearance, after speaking with Kathy, and after reviewing the information available, it becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the possibility that Louise may have had reasons to want to shape the narrative of what happened to Barb from the very beginning. Reasons to omit things, reasons to redirect attention, reasons to frame events in a particular way. Whether those reasons stemmed from guilt, fear, self-preservation, denial, or something else entirely is a question we will continue to explore. But what becomes clear is that Louise was not simply a neutral observer recounting events. She was an active participant in Barb's life, and potentially an active participant in shaping the story of what happened to Barb after she vanished. That distinction matters a lot, because once you start questioning the source of a story, you inevitably begin to question the story itself. Was Barb really having dinner with a friend and a boyfriend? Was she really last seen walking alone toward Recreation Park? And did those events happen exactly as they've been described for more than 45 years now? Or has that narrative survived simply because it was repeated often enough that people stopped questioning it? Those are uncomfortable questions, but they are questions that need to be asked. They are questions that Kathy herself has spent decades asking. The more I spoke to Kathy, the more I realized that the version of events that she believes is most likely is not necessarily the version you'll find repeated throughout the true crime world. And frankly, after familiarizing myself with the facts, I find myself in agreement. So if you've reached this point in the case, you may notice that some of what follows differs from the commonly accepted timeline. That's intentional. This is not about me wanting to be a contrarian. It's not about reinventing the case. It's about following the evidence, listening to the people closest to Barb, and being willing to question assumptions that may have been accepted for many years without sufficient scrutiny. Because somewhere in those final hours lies the truth. And all this time later, that truth remains frustratingly out of reach. What follows in this episode may not align perfectly with the version of events that you've heard before. but it does align with what Kathy believes most likely happened. And considering everything Kathy has lived through, everything that she has learned, and all the sacrifices that she has made devoting herself to finding answers for her sister, I believe that her perspective deserves to be heard. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that there are a few different versions of what supposedly happened that evening, particularly when it comes to this dinner that Barb allegedly had before she disappeared. And honestly, trying to sort through those details more than 4 decades later can feel a little like digging through an old family photo album where half the pictures are missing their labels. Everybody remembers pieces of the story, but not necessarily the exact same pieces. One detail that has always stood out to me involves the person Louise identified as Barb's boyfriend. And I find myself being careful with that description because as far as I can tell, Louise seems to have been the primary, if not the only person referring to this young man that way, as Barb's boyfriend. Now, could Louise have simply misunderstood the nature of the relationship? Absolutely. Could she have confused a friend for a boyfriend? Sure. Could she have assumed that there was something more there than there actually was? Of course. Teenagers have friends. They hang out in groups. They spend time with boys and girls. Sometimes adults draw conclusions that aren't necessarily accurate. Anything is possible. The reason this detail catches my attention is because nobody else in Barb's circle seems to have talked about a boyfriend. Not Kathy, not Diane, neither Diane, not the people who were closest to Barb during that period in her life. Take her friend Diane, for example. This was the girl Barb was planning to move in with later on that year when she turned 16. The two girls had made plans. They had talked about the future. They were close friends who spent a good amount of time together. If Barb had a serious boyfriend, you would think that Diane would have at least known something about him. Yet, according to her, there wasn't some well-known boyfriend that they or anybody else was ever talking about. And then there's Kathy. And well, this is where the story starts to carry a little bit more sadness with it. Because Kathy readily admits that she wasn't necessarily the person who would have known every detail of Barb's life at that point when she disappeared. About a year and a half earlier, their relationship had taken a painful turn after the party incident that I had discussed previously. The two sisters still loved one another, but they certainly weren't as close as they once had been. The easy conversations weren't quite as easy anymore. The trust wasn't quite what it had once been, and Kathy knew it. So when I asked Kathy about this alleged boyfriend, she told me she knew absolutely nothing about him. But she also acknowledged that she probably wouldn't have been in the loop even if there had been a boyfriend. After all, from Barb's perspective, Kathy was that little sister who had snitched to their mother on her a year or so earlier. Whether that was fair or not, that particular wound had never fully healed. And that's one of the sadder aspects looking back on these stories now. Because when families lose someone unexpectedly, people often find themselves revisiting old memories and old disagreements through a completely different lens. The arguments that had once seemed enormous suddenly feel small. The hurt feelings that once seemed permanent suddenly don't seem nearly as important. And you can't help but wonder what those relationships might have looked like if there had been simply more time. Would Barb and Kathy have become close again? Would Barb have eventually laughed about the whole thing? Would the girls have found themselves sitting together years later telling their own children's stories about growing up in Williston? Nobody gets to know. Instead, we're left trying to reconstruct pieces of Barb's life from memories, conversations, and fragments of information that survived after she was gone. And one of those fragments is this mysterious boyfriend that only seems to appear in certain versions of the story. Maybe he was a boyfriend, maybe he wasn't. But whatever the truth is, it remains one more unanswered question in a case that has far too many of them. Now, there is another version of this story about the dinner that occasionally surfaces when people discuss Barb's final known hours, and this one adds an entirely different wrinkle to the mystery. According to this alternate theory, Louise herself may have been present at this alleged dinner with Barb and the young man that Louise would later identify as Barb's boyfriend. And honestly, as strange as that might initially sound, it's one of the few explanations that would help answer a question I've found myself returning to again and again, which is, how did Louise know so much? Because that's really the issue here. In the hours, days, and weeks following Barb's disappearance, Louise was the one who was able to provide law enforcement with various details about Barb's activities, relationships, and movements. But when you step back and examine what we know about their relationship at the time, it creates something of a puzzle. By most accounts, Louise and Barb were not particularly close. They were living under the same roof, certainly, but that's not the same thing as being deeply involved in one another's lives. Barb was 15. She had friends, she had plans, she had her own social circle. She was talking about moving out, and from everything that I've been told and come to understand, Barb wasn't exactly running home every single day, eager to tell her mother every detail about what was happening in her personal life. So that naturally raises a question. If Louise wasn't truly in the loop regarding Barb's life, how was she able to provide investigators with so much information? If she wasn't present for these events, where was it all coming from? Who was telling her these things that she provided to law enforcement? How did she learn them? And perhaps most importantly, when did she learn them? Now, if Louise was actually present at this dinner, at least some of those questions would become easier to answer. Of course, she would know who was there. Of course, she would know what was discussed. And she would know where Barb had been and who she had been spending time with. That information would have come directly from firsthand observation. Simple, right? The problem is that we're not entirely sure that happened either. And that's where the mystery starts twisting back in on itself. Because if Louise wasn't there, we're left trying to understand how she became the source of so much information surrounding Barb's final known movements. The deeper you dig, the more you find yourself chasing the same handful of questions in circles. Where did Louise get her information? Who provided it to her? How much of it was firsthand knowledge? How much of it was assumption? How much was hearsay? And how much, if any, was something else entirely? Those questions become especially important because the answers just don't affect our understanding of Barb's final hours. They affect our understanding of this entire investigation. After all, investigators can only follow the information that they're given. And if some of the earliest information that they received originated from Louise, then understanding where Louise got that information becomes critically important. But perhaps the most unsettling question isn't where the information came from, it's why. Why was this particular version of events presented? Why are certain details emphasized? Why have some stories remained remarkably consistent while others seem to shift depending on who's telling them? And if some of the information turns out to be inaccurate, mistaken, or incomplete, was that simply the result of confusion and faulty memory? Or was there another reason? That's where things begin to get uncomfortable. Because once you start asking why, you're no longer just examining what happened to Barb. You're examining the motivations of the people around her. And as we will eventually see, that opens the door to some very difficult questions that have lingered over this case. So somehow Louise ended up being remarkably in the know about Barb's life, allegedly. And here's where I have to pause for a second. Because if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you already know that I have a deeply unhealthy relationship with certainty. I question everything. I question timelines, witnesses, motives, assumptions. If somebody tries to tell me that the sky is blue, my first instinct is probably going to be according to whom. And that's especially true in a case like this. This is not a solved case. This isn't even a case where we know with certainty what happened during Barb's final hours. This is a mystery, a 4 decades long mystery. So when I see statements repeated online as absolute fact, I immediately become skeptical. Not because they're necessarily wrong, but because nobody seems to know anything for certain. Even during my conversations with Kathy, there were plenty of moments where the answer was, I don't know, or I don't remember. And honestly, those answers are frustrating when you're desperately searching for the truth. It's been very frustrating to try to figure out and piece together what actually happened here. But those answers are also honest. Sometimes the most truthful answer a person can give is, I don't know. Unfortunately, those kinds of answers also leave a lot of empty space. And human beings are absolutely frustrated by empty spaces. We rush to fill them with theories, with assumptions, with speculation, with conjecture, with stories that make us feel like we've solved a puzzle. And if you know this show, you know that I'm not particularly interested in running headfirst down every single rabbit hole that we come across. Although it feels like I do sometimes, right? Because I can talk about something at length forever and ever, right? This case has enough rabbit holes to keep us busy until the next ice age. Instead, I generally try to focus on the theories that make the most sense based on the information available. Not every possibility, not every rumor, not every piece of case folklore that's been floating around the internet since dial-up was a thing, just the ones that seem worth our attention. If I did do that, if I went down every avenue, every possibility, if I chased down every single thing I heard, can you imagine how long we'd be sitting here talking about the cases that I've covered over the years? I would never shut up. Which brings me back to Louise, because Louise apparently had quite a bit to say about this alleged boyfriend. If there's rabbit holes in this case, Louise is the one that started the digging. Not only did Louise claim Barb had a boyfriend, she even supplied a name, Stacy Werder. Now, before anyone gets excited and starts drawing red strings across a conspiracy board, let me be clear. I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time treating Stacy as a suspect or even a person of interest, because quite frankly, I don't believe he was either. In fact, I'll go a step further. I don't believe Stacy was Barb's boyfriend at all. Could he have known Barb? Sure. Could their paths have crossed? Absolutely. Could they have shared mutual friends or acquaintances in a town the size of Williston? Of course. But that's a far cry from concluding he was somehow central to Barb's disappearance. And what's interesting is that the only person who seems to have consistently inserted Stacy's name into this conversation was Louise Cotton. So naturally, I asked Kathy a very direct question. Let's assume for a moment that Barb actually did have a boyfriend. Not just a boy she knew, not just a friend, not just somebody she occasionally spent time with, an actual boyfriend, a real teenage relationship. Would Louise have approved of that? Would Barb have openly shared that information with her mother, or would she have hidden it? Kathy didn't hesitate in her answer. She said that Barb would have hidden it. That was it. And honestly, that answer makes sense given everything we've learned about their relationship. So I followed up. I asked Kathy, okay, so if Barb would have kept a boyfriend's secret from Louise, how likely is it that Louise would be going out to dinner with Barb and this boyfriend? and not only know about this relationship, but apparently be perfectly okay with it? Kathy's answer, again, was simple. Quote, very unlikely, unquote. That's what she told me. Very unlikely. Those two words have rattled around in my brain ever since. Because if that's true, then we're left with another uncomfortable question. How in the world did Louise know so much? Or perhaps more accurately, how much did she actually know? As we move forward, I think it's imperative to keep that in mind. Many of the earliest leads in this case, many of the details investigators pursued, many of the assumptions that became a part of the accepted narrative did in fact originate with Louise. And for whatever reason, much of that information appears to have been accepted at face value, which, to be fair, isn't exactly shocking. Louise is the mother. Of course investigators would listen to her. Of course they'd assume she was trying to help. Of course they'd believe she was providing accurate information. Why wouldn't they? After all, what mother wouldn't want to help find her missing child? And that's where this story starts to become uncomfortable, because history has shown us that being a parent doesn't automatically make somebody a reliable narrator. Sometimes parents tell the truth, sometimes they tell half-truths, sometimes they misremember, sometimes they protect themselves, or sometimes they protect others. And unfortunately, sometimes parents help steer an investigation in directions it never should have gone. I mean, Casey Anthony, anyone? Now, am I saying that that's what happened here in this case? Not necessarily. But I am saying that before we accept every detail in this case as gospel, we should probably stop and ask where that information came from in the first place. Because once you start tracing those breadcrumbs back to the source, you may find yourself looking at the entire story a little differently. So now we're going to talk about another possibility that emerged in the wake of Barb's disappearance. There was another reported sighting of Barb that has entered the conversation over the years. And this one centers around a party that was allegedly taking place at the 18th Street apartments. According to the accounts that eventually surfaced, the people hosting the party remembered Barb being there with a young man. That young man is said to have possibly been Stacy Werder, though even that detail comes with a healthy amount of uncertainty attached to it. As the story goes, at least one witness recalled seeing Barb leave the party with a guy who was assumed to be her boyfriend. But according to those same recollections, the young man later returned to the party by himself and allegedly told people that Barb had gotten a ride with someone else. And apparently, that wasn't the end of his involvement. According to the accounts that surfaced decades later, he reportedly returned the following day, asking people whether they had seen Barb. Now, on the surface, that sounds like potentially important information. The problem is when you start pulling on the thread, the timeline surrounding when this information surfaced becomes almost as interesting as the information itself. When I asked Kathy about the party at the 18th Street apartments, she told me something that immediately caught my attention. According to Kathy, neither she nor, as far as she knows, law enforcement were aware of this party back in 1981. In fact, Kathy said she didn't hear anything about it until 2021. Think about that for a moment. It wasn't 1982, not 85, not 91. It was 40 years later. So naturally that raises the question, where did this information suddenly come from? Well, the answer appears to be that it emerged during the extensive work that was done by the Dakota Spotlight podcast. To their credit, they spent a tremendous amount of time speaking with people who may have been connected to the case and people who had lived in Williston at the time that Barb disappeared. And when you start asking questions about a small town mystery that has lingered in the background for more than 4 decades, something interesting tends to happen. People start remembering things. People start talking. People start digging through old memories they haven't thought about in years. And honestly, I can see how that would happen. Imagine living in a town where most people's lives revolve around ranching, farming, oil work, family, and the ordinary routines of everyday life. Then suddenly a podcast arrives and wants to talk about a disappearance that happened 45 years ago, or at the time that the Dakota Spotlight started, it was 40 years ago. A disappearance most people probably assumed would never be discussed again. A disappearance many people may have privately thought about, but never publicly talked about. It's not hard to imagine people coming out of the woodwork saying, "You know what? I remember something," or "I never thought this mattered, but," or "now that you mention it." And that appears to be where much of the information about this alleged party came from. Old memories, conversations, recollections that resurfaced decades later. And to be clear, I'm not dismissing those memories, not at all. Some of the most important breakthroughs in cold cases have come from people remembering details years later. But I do find myself asking a very obvious question. Where was all of this information in 1981? Where were these witnesses? Where were these accounts? Where was this party? What about this young man? Where were the people saying that they saw Barb leave? Because if these details were accurate and known at the time, they could have been incredibly important. Instead, they seem to have emerged decades after the fact. And unfortunately, that's where the frustrations surrounding this investigation continue to pile up. While these leads may or may not have been useful, the reality is that much of the early investigation appears to have been driven by information coming from Louise herself. And many of those early leads appear to have directed attention away from possibilities that, in hindsight, perhaps deserved more scrutiny. Meanwhile, one narrative gained traction almost immediately, and that is the runaway narrative. Barb was 15. Barb was rebellious. Barb didn't get along with her mom. Barb wanted independence. Therefore, Barb must have been a runaway. Case closed, except it wasn't closed. Not even close. The problem with labeling a missing teenager a runaway from the outset is that it often changes how people respond. It changes urgency. It changes priorities. And it changes the questions investigators ask, and perhaps more importantly, the questions that they stop asking. In Barb's case, that narrative appears to have settled over the investigation almost immediately. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, it created a lens through which everything else was viewed. So now, 45 plus years later, we're trying to untangle what was known, what was assumed, what was forgotten, and what may have never been investigated thoroughly in the first place. And that makes this case even more frustrating, because every time you uncover a new lead, a new witness, a new recollection, or a new possibility, you're forced to ask the same question all over again. What if somebody had known this in 1981? And perhaps even more frustrating, what if somebody did, and that opportunity was squandered? As I continued digging through the timeline, I came across something that initially seemed like a small detail. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Because sometimes it's not the big things that catch your attention, it's the little things. The things that don't quite fit. The things that make you stop and ask, wait a minute, why? According to accounts from the time, Louise apparently began making phone calls looking for Barb. Now, on the surface, that doesn't sound unusual at all. A mother whose daughter hasn't come home starts calling around. I mean, this is 1981. That was pretty much the only option aside from getting in your car and looking. That's exactly what you would expect a worried parent to do. But then I learned one of the people that Louise called was Sandy Evanson. And that's where things start to get a little bit strange. If you remember, Sandy was a childhood friend of Barb's. The two girls had been close when they were younger. They grew up near one another, they spent time together, and they shared the kinds of friendships that often develop in childhood. But by the time Barb disappeared, that wasn't really the relationship anymore. So when Sandy later recalled receiving a phone call from Louise that night, it stood out to her because she wasn't one of the people who would have been involved in Barb's everyday life anymore. She wasn't seeing Barb regularly. She wasn't part of Barb's immediate friend group at the time. She wasn't someone who would have necessarily known where Barb had gone on any particular day or night. Now, to be fair, Louise also called Diane, Barb's close friend, and the girl that she had been planning on moving in with when she turned 16. That makes perfect sense. If you're looking for a missing teenager, you call the people closest to them. You call the friends that they're actually spending time with. There's no mystery there. But Sandy, that one lingers in my mind because it suggests that Louise was reaching beyond Barb's current circle and into relationships that had largely faded into the background. And perhaps the most important detail of all isn't who she called, but rather when she called. Because these weren't phone calls that were being made the next morning. They weren't calls being made days later. Nor were they calls being made after weeks of searching. These weren't desperate attempts months down the road after every lead had dried up. These were phone calls that were happening immediately, the night of, before the rest of the world even knew that Barbara Cotton had disappeared. Louise was already on the phone looking for her. And the more I sit with that fact, the more complicated it feels. Part of me sees a worried mother searching for her daughter. Another part of me can't help but wonder what exactly Louise knew at that moment. How concerned was she? Why was she concerned? What made her start calling the people she did call when she did? And why did she choose the people that she chose to call? Because 45 years later, we're still trying to reconstruct the earliest hours of this case from fragments of memories and incomplete information. We're still trying to understand what people knew, when they knew it, and why they reacted the way they did. And every time I think I've found a piece that fits neatly into the puzzle, another detail comes along and knocks it loose again. What I do know is this. Before most people realized something was terribly wrong, Louise Cotton was already searching for Barb, already making calls, already asking questions, and when you look back across the decades that followed, it's hard to not wonder whether the answers to this entire mystery might be hidden somewhere within those very first hours before Barb became a missing person and before her disappearance became one very enduring mystery. And then there's another question that kept nagging at me as I spoke with Kathy. What about Kathy herself? If Barb hadn't come home that night, where was Louise's anger? Where was the panic? Where was the interrogation that, by Kathy's accounts, would have been completely in character for Louise? Because we already know how Louise reacted when she thought one of her children knew more than what they were saying. Remember the story Kathy told us about the party a year and a half earlier or so? When Kathy came home without Barb, Louise immediately demanded to know where her daughter was. Kathy tried to play dumb at first. She claimed she didn't know, but Louise wasn't buying it. According to Kathy, her mother made it abundantly clear that there were only two options: to tell the truth or to face the consequences. And Kathy, being a frightened child, told her. She pointed Louise directly to the house where Barb was at. What followed was explosive. Louise stormed into that party, grabbed Barb by the hair, dragged her outside, threw her in the car, and took her home. Whether you agree with Louise's parenting style or not, one thing is undeniable. When Louise wanted answers, she knew how to get them. She was not a passive woman. She was not timid. She was not the type of parent who simply shrugged her shoulders and said, well, I guess she'll show up eventually. At least that's not the Louise we've been hearing about throughout this story, which is why Kathy's recollection of the night that Barb disappeared struck me as odd. Because according to Kathy, none of that happened. There was no immediate confrontation. There was no demand for information from her. There was no late night grilling. No furious questioning of everyone within earshot. No ultimatum. No threats. Nothing. Kathy told me that if Louise had truly discovered that Barb hadn't come home, one of her first stops would have been Kathy herself. Immediately. She would have wanted answers. She would have demanded answers. And if she believed Kathy knew something and wasn't talking, Kathy has no doubt that her mother would have reacted exactly as she had in the past. She would have pressured her, intimidated her, insisted that she tell her everything she knew, but according to Kathy, none of that ever happened. And the frustration keeps creeping in for me. Because if Barb's disappearance was truly unexpected, where was the urgency? Where was the alarm? Where was the overwhelming concern that your 15-year-old daughter hadn't come home yet? According to Kathy, it simply wasn't there. At least not in the way that you would expect. Now, I'm not saying every parent reacts the same in a crisis. People process fear differently. People express concern differently. Some panic, some shut down, some become laser focused. Human behavior is messy. But we're not talking about a blank slate here. We're talking about Louise, a woman who, by every account that I've heard, maintained a tight grip on her household. A woman who expected her children, especially her daughters, to follow rules. She was a woman who wasn't shy about using intimidation, fear, or corporal punishment to enforce those rules when she felt that they were being ignored. That's the Louise that we've spent this entire story thus far getting to know. So when that same Louise apparently didn't react with the same intensity when Barb failed to come home, it raises questions. Difficult questions. Questions that become even harder to ignore when viewed through the lens of everything that happened afterward. Because if Louise was the type of mother who would demand immediate answers over a teenager staying too long at a party, why wasn't she demanding immediate answers when that same teenager didn't come home at all? Why wasn't Kathy being questioned? Why wasn't the house being turned upside down? Why wasn't everyone being called and confronted? Why wasn't there a sense of urgency equal to the seriousness of the situation? Those are questions I can't answer, but they are questions that linger. And the more I learn about this case, the more I dig, the harder those questions become to dismiss. Because somewhere between the Louise who dragged Barb home by her hair and the Louise who, according to Kathy, displayed remarkably little urgency when Barb vanished, there's a disconnect that isn't sitting right with me. And all these years later, it's one more piece of this mystery that refuses to fit neatly into place. As Kathy and I continued talking about the night Barb disappeared, I asked her to walk me through what she remembered from her own perspective. And honestly, some of the details she shared struck me as incredibly important, yet they seem to get glossed over or omitted entirely in many retellings of the story. I asked Kathy a simple question. When did you realize Barb was missing? She told me that when she woke up on the morning of April 12, 1981, she immediately noticed that Barb wasn't in her bed. Her sister had never come home. Now put yourself in Kathy's shoes for a moment. She was just a kid. She woke up expecting to see her sister in the room that they shared, and instead she's greeted by an empty bed. Perhaps at first there was confusion. Maybe she assumed Barb came in late and left early. Maybe she thinks there's some perfectly ordinary explanation. But as it turned out, there wasn't. So Kathy did what most kids would do. She went to wake up her mother. She walked into Louise's room and told her that Barb wasn't home. And according to Kathy, Louise acted surprised. That distinction would not become significant until many years later. In fact, Kathy told me it was roughly 33 years into this case before she fully realized the implication of what happened that morning. Because by the time Kathy woke up, discovered Barb's empty bed, and went to alert her mother, Louise had already known that Barb hadn't come home. She already knew. We know she had been making phone calls the night before. We know that she had been looking for Barb. We know Louise was aware that Barb was out past curfew, and not just a little past curfew. Louise's rule was the girls were expected to be home when the streetlights came on. That wasn't a vague suggestion, that was the rules. And by Kathy's account, Louise wasn't exactly known for being flexible about her rules. Yet somehow, after spending part of the evening calling around looking for Barb, Louise managed to go to bed, fall asleep, and stay asleep until Kathy woke her up the next morning. At least, that was Kathy's perspective. That's the part that continues to bother me. Not because it's impossible, because almost anything is possible, but because it feels so inconsistent with everything we've heard about Louise up to this point. This is the same woman who, less than 2 years earlier, erupted when Kathy came home without Barb. The same woman who demanded answers. The same woman who dragged Barb home from a party by her hair. The same woman who was known for strict rules, harsh discipline, and wanting to know exactly where her children were at all times. Louise was a very controlling woman. Yet, on the night that Barb failed to come home entirely, the urgency is remarkably absent. And perhaps the most baffling part of it all, Louise never woke Kathy up. She never went into the girls' room. She never demanded to know where Barb was. She never asked Kathy whether she had seen Barb. She never questioned her about who Barb may have been with. She never pressed Kathy for information. Nothing of the sort ever happened that night. And that's where the sadness starts mixing in with the frustration for me. Because poor Kathy spent decades looking back on that morning through the eyes of a child. And it wasn't until much later that she realized that the sequence of events didn't quite add up. She had walked into that room believing that she was delivering important news to her mother. Believing that she was the one informing her that Barb hadn't come home, only to realize decades later that her mom had apparently known all along. And instead of spending the night frantically searching, pacing the floor, waking up the household and demanding answers from anyone who might have them, Louise was asleep. Apparently asleep, because I can't imagine whatever the scenario was, whatever happened to Barb, that Louise just was resting soundly. But she was apparently unconcerned enough to get some rest while her 15-year-old daughter was missing, out well past curfew and nowhere to be found. Maybe there's an explanation for that, maybe there isn't. But it's one of those details that leaves me with more questions than answers, and unfortunately, that's becoming a recurring theme in this case. So let's just sit with that for a moment. Kathy wakes up on the morning of April 12, 1981, and immediately realizes that something is wrong. The sister that she shared a bedroom with never came home. For Kathy, that realization must have been unsettling enough on its own. But what happened next is the part that continues to stick with me. She goes to wake up her mom, and what does she find? Not a frantic parent sitting at the kitchen table waiting for the sun to come up. Not someone pacing the floor. Not someone staring out the window waiting for headlights to pull into the driveway. She finds Louise in bed, apparently comfortable enough to get through the night, despite the fact her 15-year-old daughter had never come home. Kathy wakes Louise up, and Louise responds with what Kathy described as surprise, or at least some version of surprise. But then decades later, Kathy realized something she hadn't fully appreciated at the time: the fact that her mom already had the knowledge that Barb wasn't there. By the time Kathy walked into that room that morning, she wasn't delivering new information to her mom at all. She was informing her mother of something that she already knew. Now, to be fair, older sister Diane has also spoken about those early days. According to Diane, when Louise talked to her about Barb's disappearance, she did sound worried. And honestly, I don't doubt that. I think there was probably concern, and real anxiety, real fear. I don't have much trouble believing that at all. The question that keeps nagging at me isn't whether Louise was concerned. The question is, concerned about what? Or perhaps more accurately, concerned about whom? Because when I compare this situation to stories that we've already heard about Louise, the difference is impossible for me to ignore. Yet now we're talking about a 15-year-old girl who never came home at all. And somehow the response feels smaller, quieter. And that's the part that I struggle with. Not because I expect every parent to react identically in every situation. People obviously don't work that way. Fear doesn't work that way. But when viewed against everything else we know about Louise, this level of urgency simply feels different. And maybe there's a perfectly innocent explanation for that. Maybe there isn't. But it does leave me with a lingering sense of sadness, because somewhere in that house was a little sister waking up to an empty bed. A family beginning to realize something was terribly wrong. And a mother whose reaction, for better or for worse, continues to raise questions all these years later. Questions that have never really gone away. Questions that have become harder to ignore the more you learn about this case. And questions that leave me wondering whether the concern Louise displayed in those early hours was directed entirely at finding Barb, or whether there was something else weighing on her mind as well. So dreamers, we're going to end this episode here. You can go ahead and jump to part 3, which is episode 334. And we're going to pick up the timeline from where Louise Cotton officially reported Barb missing, which happened mid-afternoon, the day after Barb was last seen. Again, I want to thank Anthony W. and Kathy for their guidance in helping me put these episodes together. We're going to finish up the timeline in part 3. And as we make our way towards the end of this, which will be in part 4, I will tell you what both Kathy and I believe Barb's fate to have been. So until next time, as always, take care, be safe, and sweet dreams.